Hi, my name is Sade Hamilton. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I am a Youth for Truth member. I work with the night ministry, and I also work with the National Network for Youth. I am an advocate for homeless youth.
My name is Silas Fallendorf, and I sit on the advisory board for the National Network for Youth. Coming here from Seattle, Washington. I was homeless for a number of years, and now I'm not. But one thing that I can say that I'm super grateful for and all that experience is became a really good banjo player because I had a lot of time on my hands.
Hi, my name is Courtney Smith, and I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I'm on the advisory board for the National Network for Youth. I also work as a community service manager for THAW. I just recently founded an organization called Detroit Phoenix Center. It's a drop-in center for homeless youth in the city of Detroit.
Hi, my name is Aja Ellington. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. Grew up in South Bend. I currently work for the Youth Service Bureau of St. Joseph County at a homeless teen mother transitional living program.
Hello, my name is Richard Hooks Wayman, and I'm the National Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund, but I'm also a proud member of the American Bar Association and have been for many years. I've been affiliated with both the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty as well as the Commission on Youth at Risk, and I'm very excited about the fact that the ABA is supporting a new initiative called the Homeless Youth Legal Network. It is a new initiative to try to address the legal issues of unaccompanied homeless youth, especially around the issues of kids coming out of the foster care, child welfare, or juvenile justice systems. And it's really about helping us achieve greater capacity and connectivity in this area.
My name's Darla Bardine, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Network for Youth. I'm also a proud member of the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and kind of wearing dual hats in my ABA membership and my role as running the premier kind of network membership organization for service providers serving runaway and homeless youth. It is really critical for service providers to be involved in the ABA's launch of the Homeless Youth Legal Network because service providers, our members are on the ground in the front lines, and they know the real legal barriers that the young people they seek to serve are facing. And so I'm really excited about partnering up pro bono attorneys with all of our member organizations so that more young people can access the legal services that they need to gain the employment that they're trying to seek, to gain the safety and the housing that they're also trying to seek, but really encountering very real legal barriers that service providers alone don't have the capacity to help them meet. So I'm excited about partnering with the ABA and the National Network for Youth, and also in my role on the ABA to really help make this happen because I know that young people are going to benefit all over the country.
Hi, I'm Rich Hooks Wayman, and I serve as the National Executive Director for the Children's Defense Fund. We're a nonprofit organization here in Washington, D.C. that advocates for children and youth. However, in my background, I used to represent unaccompanied homeless youth as a lawyer. I graduated from law school in the Midwest in Iowa in 1992 and began as a legal aid attorney in Minnesota in 1992, representing children and youth and families on legal matters. I quickly began to realize that the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, was a city that had a lot of homeless youth, and there wasn't enough services. So kids were coming to us almost every week asking for help, and there wasn't shelter beds, there wasn't housing opportunities for them, and there weren't even case managers or social workers willing to help them because there just wasn't capacity. So we began to advocate on behalf of the population, and that's how I started to get involved in this work. I litigated and represented youth and children for about 8 years at Legal Aid. And then I became the director of a street outreach program called StreetWorks, which was a collaborative of 12 different nonprofit organizations that all contributed to street outreach to kids trying to stop the exploitation of youth on the streets in the Twin Cities and to try to find them resources. And while there, we began to realize that there wasn't a state law to protect homeless youth. And so I wrote a state law called the Minnesota Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. And the act provided a definition of youth that were having difficulties not having homes, and also provided a spectrum of services for them that they needed. And we worked for 5 years to finally get it enacted. It took us a really long time because laws are never simple, and it's always difficult to try to convince lawmakers to give money away. But that's what we were doing. We said you not only have to recognize this population, but you need to fund the services themselves. And it took us 5 to 6 years to get that done. And then I came out to Washington, D.C., and I began to advocate for homeless youth at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. and a long journey, came back to Washington, D.C., and am now at the Children's Defense Fund. And I'm so glad that you guys are here today. So I'll start with my questions. One of the things we know about homeless youth is that they oftentimes have difficulties when they're on their own getting ID or having troubles with police officers or the law. So one of my first questions is, did you ever have experiences having difficulties securing identification, having IDs, or having run-ins with police officers because of your homeless status?
Hi, my name is Silas Follendorf. I'm with the National Network for Youth, and in my experience, I dealt with police officers, like law enforcement, a lot, almost every day. When I was experiencing houselessness when I was younger, I got a lot of tickets, a lot of tickets for things like illegal camping, things for, illegal trespassing, for, like drinking in public, which is definitely something that I probably would have been doing had I had a home. And I did have the opportunity to work with some folks with a program called Lawyers Fostering Independence out in Seattle. I had 8 warrants, all for basically being houseless, all because I didn't have a place to go and because my homelessness was visible, which I just think is really interesting. And because in this country, I feel like when you are a young person and you have no place to go, you are invisible whenever you are asking for help. But when you are finally meeting your needs, whether that be sleeping, stealing in order to support yourself, or, just the consumption of substances in order to sort of just deal with the trauma and the crisis of the everyday life, then you are visible. And I feel like that's when the authorities get involved. So like I said, I had 8 warrants, but they were all for bench warrants. They were all for things that I was just trying to do to survive. And that made getting a job in those cities, in those states, impossible for me, so I had to leave because I couldn't survive there. A friend of mine, years later, was going to buy a house. And so we were, just going to all of these houses together, looking at them, putting my name on the background check. And every time my name was on the background check, we didn't get the house, and we didn't know why. And I found out that some of my tickets had gone to collections. And so because of that, it prevented me from, getting stable housing. But through working with LFI, I had the opportunity to kind of go back through, check out those old warrants, work with the cities and the towns and the states that I had them in and get them expunged. But it took almost a year to do that. And if I had been, 1 year older, I wouldn't have had access at all, period. So while I'm grateful that, LFI exists, I also didn't know it existed when I was 19, 20, 21, 22. I got these things taken care of when I was 24, almost 25, and out of sort of that youth, young adult bracket.
And I know sometimes there's a lot of stigma, like you were saying, around the fact that homeless youth oftentimes have to engage in activities, illegal activities, just to survive, right? Mm-hmm. And so it becomes the stigma around not wanting to admit that because you have to do it to survive. But I'm wondering, is there any part of the fact that attorneys in the relationship with the client have to keep and hold information confidential and protect, privacy issues to the extent that that's helpful for the client? Do you think that that was an important factor in you considering kind of how to talk to lawyers?
I mean, yeah, that's crucial. That's the only way that you're going to be able to develop and keep a relationship, I feel like with anybody in your world, but especially folks who have been let down by systems, who have been let down by people in their community, and most importantly, I feel like let down by adults. Right. Because we do have to recognize that there is an inherent power dynamic in the relation. Well, I have to recognize, right, in my relationship with my attorney, there is an inherent power dynamic in that, in the way that not only were they the ones with all of the power, because they were an attorney, and I was, somebody who was just, I was just like this homeless kid, A. But B, too, it's like your age. I just had dealt with so many adults who had, like I said, just let me down and had maybe not been so kind. The fact that I was able to trust these folks with my stories, and they kept showing up, that showed me that I could trust them. And they kept asking me questions and kept, if I said no, this is all, I can't talk about this anymore today, or I need a break, I could go and do that, and we could resume.
Right. Your point about the fact that there's a power differential has to be considered, because the attorneys have to realize that not only do they have race and class, but they also have educational status. And we know in our society that information is power, right? So even to be able to give homeless youth information about what rights they have, and like you said, the legal jargon, trying to understand what that legal jargon means and how the process works, that's helpful in transferring some of the power back to, I think, homeless youth so they can actually have the information they need to have actually advocate for themselves in some ways. I think that's really important dynamic, but you have to recognize the power differential, and I think part of the role of being an attorney is trying to recognize that and doing all that you can to try to transfer some of that power back, or at least to empower the youth to advocate for themselves.
Yes, absolutely.
That's great. Okay, so I'm going to move on now. We're going to move on to talk a little bit about the intersection of social services, maybe, or the next one is about case managers and social services. So in your experience, can you describe for me the interaction between how youth may require social services, shelter, transitional housing, case management, drop-in services, street outreach, and the intersection of those social services with also having a legal advocate? Is it important for the social services to have access to lawyers and for lawyers to have access to social services? Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's very important because youth will potentially work with both of those, so just to make sure that all three of them are on the same page. I know as a youth it was hard for me to open up to anyone for that matter. How I was raised, lawyers, basically everyone was out to get us, out to break our family up, the whole 9 yards. So with the social services and the lawyers being on the same page, because they're hearing the same feedback.
If you are providing services to young people experiencing homelessness, I feel like there does really need to be some kind of like attorney or lawyer or someone present who can not only like understand, the way of the law, but also be able to sort of bridge that gap. Because in my experience, a lot of my friends, and then when I started working in social services, a lot of my clients also had a lot of run-ins, with like police officers and, like warrants and tickets and all of these things. And so I feel like if we're going to be doing this work and if we're going to be doing this well, it has to be all-encompassing, because shelter is important and housing is important and education is important, but it's really hard to get all of those things if you are, like dealing with, probation officers, or if you keep going to jail every time you try to sleep. You're probably not going to go to school the next day.
That's great. Thank you. We know from surveys of youth and from research that one of the major barriers to ending youth homelessness is the fact that young people oftentimes have troubles finding a job. So what were some of the barriers you experienced, and can you talk a little bit about what youth need in order to secure employment?
Yes, it's been very hard for me trying to find a job, because to get a job, you need an ID. And if you're homeless, you don't have a place where you can call home to get an ID. So without an ID, you can't get a social, can't get a birth certificate. Without an address, you can't get an ID, so you have no job. So that's some of the barriers that I had to face in finding a job. And then when I did find a job, how am I going to get a check if I don't have a home?
Well, tell me a little bit, Sade, tell me a little bit about how you actually then broke through those barriers. What did you do to break through those barriers to actually help you find either part-time or full-time employment for yourself?
I ended up going to a drop-in center where I found an address to have mail sent to. So once I was there, I had mail get sent there for 3-4 days, and I was able to obtain a social security card, which able to get an ID. But at the same time, I wasn't able to work full-time. I had to get a part-time job due to me living on the streets, having kids and stuff like that.
That's great. Thanks for that information. Go ahead. Sure.
Growing up, when it came to employment, I was always really confident. I'm put on a nice outfit, go talk. I remember one time, probably a week straight, I went to probably 20 places to try to obtain employment. I spoke well the whole 9 yards, but I was doing everything wrong, everything from how I was filling out the application to not even having knowledge on the company that I wanted to work for, the place I wanted to work for. So we have the Youth Service Bureau in South Bend, and they offer a lot of services. And even though I saw this big yellow and black sign that said YSB, I never knew what it was, or I never went there. So basically learning to reach out and go to places and feeling comfortable with reaching out and going to places to get help. That's what actually helped me begin to start finding employment, or like the work one, taking resume building classes, the whole 9 yards. But I was able to get out and do that myself before people that aren't comfortable or don't have awareness of these agencies that help with things like that, or even feel comfortable with, let me go in here and get help, and they're not going to be all in my business and once again try to break up my home or different things.
We know that homeless youth oftentimes lack basic needs, and that oftentimes they may require public assistance in getting things like food stamps, nutrition programs, or emergency assistance, or rental assistance. We also know that there's barriers to that. I'm wondering if as homeless youth or as young adults, if you've ever been denied those type of basic need assistance from the public systems.
Well, I have been denied many a times due to the fact that I was in the system and I was adopted. So once my mom passed away, I was left out alone by myself, but they feel like I still had a guardian. So they was like, well, if you have a guardian, then they receive assistance for you. And due to me not having a home, they was like, well, if you don't have a home, how will you receive these assistance? So now to this day, I have many medical bills that I have to pay due to me going back and forth to the hospital. With the food stamps, well, they came and then I got sanctioned because I wasn't receiving no mail for me to go back. So I got sanctioned with food stamps. I didn't get emergency assistance. In order to get, like in Chicago, in order to go to food pantries and stuff, you have to have an ID to verify your address to get like canned goods, free food. So I wasn't able to go in and get free food. So it was many barriers, like being homeless, houseless. I like our word, houseless.
I do too. That's a great word. Tell me, when you were denied those services, or when you had those difficulties in trying to get things because you were houseless or not having an address, or just being told, no, you're in the system in the wrong way, did you ever get legal help in order to address that situation?
No, because I wasn't aware of legal assistance then. So with DCFS, I thought they was on my side, but when I went, that was my legal assistant, DCFS. I felt like they was supposed to help me. I called my caseworker, but it seemed like everyone was against me, like, you're 18 now, so you are on your own. So, no, I never really reached out to get, like, a lawyer because I had no money, know. I'm like, y'all expensive, so how I'm finna get a lawyer? So I was out there trying to defend myself. So I went to, like, drop-in centers, and I found resources like that at shelters and stuff. But, like, going to, like, the American Bar Association, no.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. That's great. Thank you for all that. So as a young adult, I hope that you want to advocate for other people experiencing the same conditions that you might have experienced. So if you were talking to leaders today about things that they could do to prevent situations from hurting other young people, what would you tell them to do?
But I think, like, people, like presidents and congressmen, they should walk the streets and see what's going on. Instead of just being on the inside looking out, they should be on the outside trying to get in. But that's how I was, But yeah, they should go out and see the kids on the street, experience it. Maybe spend a day out there on the street, and maybe they'll feel how we feel.
When I was experiencing homelessness as a young person, I was living in a transitional program, and there were so many zero tolerance policies. Like, I think, and I got kicked out of plenty of programs when I was younger. And I think I know that it had to do a lot with just some of the zero tolerance. Like, I think, zero tolerance for just having cell phones or being late for your curfew or missing a chore when you're a teenager. Those are things that you do, right? And so I think that there should be a balance or some education around how we can, still discipline or teach structure to young people without taking away their livelihood, and recognizing that their humanity should not be at stake, because of mistakes that they make. And so I think for me, a lot of the programs that I was put out of, I think if there was, just a little less rules and more just a lot meeting people where they are, I think that could have been prevented in many different ways. And then also thinking back to the whole having been denied food stamps, or, I look back and remember my name being used by my parents at the time, and I wasn't able to obtain, financial assistance from the government. Here I am now, years later, stable, and I still have, like Sharday spoke to, those hospital bills when I could not get health insurance because I was still on the case of someone else, and there wasn't a lot of education around, accessing legal support to kind of alleviate some of that.
Can I ask you one follow-up question?
Yes.
When you were in those programs and they had that zero tolerance policy and they said you're out now, did that agency or nonprofit organization ever say, and we'll get you to a lawyer if you want to talk about your rights to someone?
No, never. That probably would have put them in a situation. But there was an organization, if I could show a more positive side to how that worked. There was an organization that I was, a transitional program that I was in, that I said, I don't like what's going on. And they said, so what would you do to propose a change? And so instead of kicking me out, they allowed me to write a proposal on how I would handle the situation if I were in that. And that was my first introduction to like advocacy. I was like, wait, my voice matters. And here I am years later, and I still am writing those proposals, right? Yeah. And so it's really cool to be able to see, when human service organizations, when at that time they meet you, where you are. And even looking back, when I was in college, I remember one of the staff member coming back and saying, we took your suggestion and this is what we're doing. And so I think that was a more positive. But before it had got to that point, it was tons of other organizations just like, we don't want to hear what you have to say. So
that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. That's very good. Do you want to go back to the thing about if you had advice for leaders about what they could do to prevent youth homelessness? What would you tell them? What would you tell them they needed to do now?
I'm just going to say one thing because that's a pretty loaded question and we'll be here forever, right? And I'm pretty sure my colleagues have plenty of great things to say. I think the most important thing is to have those voices at the table. And I think doing exactly what we're doing now, pulling from the lived experiences of those with the lived experiences and knowing that there's so much, we are so much more than our lived experience, and pulling from that and bringing, that voice to the table, because you can't be an expert on something you have not lived and if you don't know about. And so I think that's very important.
What a wonderful suggestion. Thank you for that. Who else wants to add your thoughts on what to tell leaders?
Stop criminalizing the homeless.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's just not helping anybody. That is not a useful tactic, and I'm still confused as to why we're still doing it. But yeah, as Monique said, get the voices at the table, create partnerships not only with folks in your community at large, but within your community as well.
I agree with everything my colleague said. I feel relationship building is very important. Providing awareness is very important. Even like they were saying, spend a day visiting with the projects and whatnot, but not only spend a day to get that experience, but just building it up every day, or building it up as much as you can. One thing about youth and children, they can see genuineness. If you're not really there to help them or support them, they'll see right through that. And I know a lot of times as a youngster, if I felt that you weren't genuinely paying attention to what I was talking about or anything like that, I would shut down. I would finish that meeting with you, but I wouldn't call you again, or I wouldn't even want your services, just because, again, that's how I was raised.
Now I'm going to change the focus to if you were sitting in front of a lawyer and you were going to help them try to figure out how they could help young people that were going through life experiences of either houselessness, homelessness, or need of basic needs. What would you want them to know about what they could do as lawyers, or how they could approach the situation that could be the most useful or helpful for the young person?
I would say starting with going to the different programs to speak with people, getting them comfortable. I didn't know a lot about my legal rights and things like that. I know in school we learned it, but it wasn't something that interested me. Like now I'm like, I really wish I would have paid attention and listened and knew my rights. So just awareness is everything, and putting the awareness in ways that youngsters can understand it,
Be real, and, be aware, be informed, have a certain level of awareness around the folks that you're going to be working with, because if you come into my drop-in center, the place where I go eat, the place where I go sleep, the place I go spend time with my friends, if you come into my community and you say you're a lawyer or an attorney here to help me and support me, and I tell you, it's like, well, I've been selling sex and I just got assaulted and I need some help, but I don't know how to do this. Judging on your response, that's really going to decide if I'm going to work with you or not.
That's right.
So yeah, and not to say, it's like we also don't hear things that maybe aren't hard or, shocking to us, but to just be real and just to be genuine and say like, okay, so where do we go from here?
Well, you're a lawyer, so I'm talking to you.
Yeah, that's right.
So what I would say is that you really can't be judgmental. You can't go around judging us because we're homeless. You don't know what we've been through. We don't know what you've been through. All we know is you have a suit, a tie, you getting money, and you coming to help us. So I just feel like that, like they say, you should go visit the shelters, start an organization, be passionate about it. Don't just do it because we finna pay you. You have to have a passion to help the homeless,
That's great. That's awesome.
I think it's important to build a relationship with law enforcement and work with the other systems, work with the social workers, establish relationships with them, because there are going to be some things that are open, like traumatic events, traumatic cases. And I think it's important for lawyers to also have a resource to refer, tools to be able to support. And I also think another thing that's important is the awareness piece that we talked about, just going in and raising awareness and then giving tools to young people to advocate for themselves. I think that's the most empowering and most powerful thing that you can do, is to be able to give the tools and share and have workshops about know your rights. What are your rights, and provide opportunities. If you're going into a drop-in center and a young person wants to go into law or legal, provide an opportunity for an internship. Open up your door to be more than just a lawyer. Maybe go, take the extra step, some mentorship. I know you may not get paid for that, but sometimes when dealing with very vulnerable populations, you have to be willing to go the extra mile.
That's great. Can I ask 2 follow-up questions, and you can take either one or none of them? But I'm also interested, so these are my 2 questions. Do you think that lawyers should have a role in not only representing and advocating for people or for young people, but also advocating for changes in law? So working at the legislature, trying to enact policies that help youth, with people? That's my first question, and not to make it too complex. And the other question I have is, in regards to working with lawyers, I think there's always a really delicate dance when you're the lawyer and you're trying to help people. There's this what I call the gulf of trust, right? There's I have to bridge this gulf of you trusting me and me trying to figure out how I can best help you. And sometimes I do that through the questions I ask, right? But sometimes those questions get to be really sensitive issues. Does that make sense? And I ask you a big question and you're like, wow, I don't know if I want to share that much of myself with you because I just met you and you're some guy with a tie and I don't really know you. So in thinking about how lawyers work with young people, are there things besides non-judgmental reactions? Are there things that they should do in knowing how to ask questions or when to ask questions that you think would be important in order to help bridge that trust? Anybody want? I know those are 2 separate questions, but I'm just interested in how they.
Yeah, can you repeat the first question?
First question
again?
is, do you think that lawyers should have a role in not only advocating and representing youth, but actually advocating for changes in laws at the state legislature or trying to enact policies?
I mean, of course. Right? You're a lawyer. That goes without saying, right? So. Of course, because if you're on the ground level working with youth with lived experiences, a lot of times our policymakers may be a little bit far removed from the challenges. So if you can come in with, firsthand experience and sharing from a compassionate standpoint, of course, some of the, knowledge that you've gained at the ground level, I think that's very important.
I feel like if you're a lawyer, you work with congressmen, you work with these people. You live in D.C., so your voice is going to be heard. So, yeah. So just get all the resources, hear from young, experienced, homeless, houseless people. Yeah.
I feel like just working from a place of curiosity is always helpful. But if you're working from a place of curiosity, it's not curiosity because of I'm asking questions because I want to know this about you. That's not going to be helpful because you're just asking for your own gain. But to ask, upon first meeting someone I'm talking about, But upon first meeting somebody, just asking from a place of curiosity in the way that, like, I'm curious, what do you want to share with me? And using open-ended questions and just getting to know somebody first. Like, don't just dive right into it because, like I said, you know, if I was just assaulted, I don't know who you are, and you want me to tell you, like, this huge, deep, heavy, intimate thing that just happened, traumatic and intimate thing that just happened to me. It just doesn't make sense.
So my current major is in social work, in therapy. And I feel that with lawyers, so like a therapist, there are stages, like the introduction stage all the way to the exit stage. And it should kind of be the same way with lawyers. Maybe structure those meetings, structure them, and know when you want to pull out that information or when they're comfortable enough to say that information. Because when speaking with a lawyer, a lot of those questions as a youth, I'm not going to answer. I don't know you. You want to break up my family? I'm not going to answer those questions. So just relationship building and being patient and knowing when to come in with this question. I know that's a lengthy process, or maybe even the lawyer working with the social workers. And I love that you said trauma-informed care. I feel that trauma-informed care is very important, especially for police officers and lawyers and whatnot, because everyone is not the same, not to mention when you bring mental disorders and everything into the conversation.
In thinking about your own experiences, do you think that if a lawyer had actually contacted you or you had had a chance to talk to a lawyer early in your experience, do you think that would have changed some of the things you experienced?
Yes, most definitely. The reason is because we would have had a bond. You know, I would be able to call you like, hey, these police trying to get me, man. What's up? You would have told me, like, just let them know I'm your lawyer, you know. Yeah, it's like you would have became part of my family. As I was growing into my adulthood, it would be somebody that I could trust.
I feel like for me, even just having somebody to have had that, you know, like a know your rights conversation with, because I feel like ultimately at the end of the day, I still would have received all of those tickets and all of those infractions for surviving. But the reality is, if I was working with a lawyer, I may have actually gone to court and contested those things, as opposed to just having them go into collections and just further in my, you know, journey into houselessness. So,
if you think about your own experiences, if you had had actually contact with a lawyer early on, do you think that would have helped you avoid some of the problems you had?
Yeah, it would have definitely helped. I'm 27 years old now. I've never worked with a lawyer, and I think of so many experiences that were lawsuits that I could have filed. Just having access to a lawyer or even having someone speak with me about the importance of a lawyer could have avoided a lot of those situations.
I too think that it would have been valuable to have had at that age, have had interactions with a lawyer. I think about a time where I was had a run-in with juvenile court, and I had something that they call a status offense. And at the time, I had no idea what that meant, but I knew that, you know, here's this thing they're saying, you know, incorrigibility, status offense, what is this? And having had no prior interactions with the law, being an honors student, you know, not simply because my parents at the time they felt that, and it was like, oh, I got to be this person with a status offense. So like I eventually started to become what I thought that this stigma was. And I think if a lawyer would have sat down with me, and now I know what that is, and I think it's absolutely ridiculous, right? And if someone would have sat down with me at that age and was like, wait, like this is not what you think it is, like, and gave me insight into that small, not even an infraction, it was just protocol, and then I think I would have responded very differently, and I wouldn't have did a lot of things post that first run in with law enforcement, with the juvenile justice system.
That's great.
I've witnessed a lot of situations where when youth are afraid, they and when they're in the court system, they plead guilty like this. So even having someone there to, okay, well, I didn't do this, but if I don't admit to doing it, I may get even more time. Like that's extremely important as youth, as adults, just to have that awareness of as if I'm not guilty of this, I'm not going to plead, I'm going to fight it, and then I'm not going to be afraid to fight it. A lot of times when you're in that situation, oh, well, the maximum is however many years, I'm just going to plead and get probation, but then that's on my background when I try to search for jobs and everything.
So for me as a young lawyer, when I first met unaccompanied youth, the first time I met an unaccompanied youth was actually at a food distribution program when we were eating soup on a sidewalk together. And she looked at me and she said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm a lawyer and I was invited here by legal aid to kind of come." I began to realize that homeless youth were some of the most vulnerable populations that I could ever advocate for. Not only were these young people that had experienced immense amounts of trauma, so these are oftentimes youth, not that this is everybody's story, but I heard enough stories where I knew that youth experienced physical abuse, neglect in their families. Sometimes their parents either didn't have the skills or actually had barriers to parenting, like mental health problems or addiction problems. These are oftentimes very poor children that had grown up in deep poverty, not knowing where their next meal was coming, and now they're on the streets or sleeping from place to place because there's no place for them to be stable in, right? So they're going from day to day just worrying about their daily survival. Where's my next meal? Where's my next bed? Who's going to exploit me? And there's adults on the streets that are trying to harm me, right? Whether physically, sexually, or economically, they're after me. Does that make sense? And on top of all of that, for me as an advocate, these were young adults that were interacting with adult systems that didn't have any wherewithal about child voice or youth advocacy, right? So they were up against law enforcement and the courts and public assistance places and school systems and all the employment criteria, and all of it was stacked against them. And they had no voice. So for me as an advocate, it was a slam dunk. If I was going to spend my time advocating for change, it was going to be with this very vulnerable population, because sometimes they were the most vulnerable, that had the least access to the rights and the powers and the empowerment that they needed to advance their lives. And for me, that really meant two things as a lawyer. It meant for me, I was going to have to represent unaccompanied homeless youth in any way that I could to help them get the basic skills and the jobs and the services that they needed so they could find their own lives of self-determination. And it also meant that I had to be a voice with them in changing the laws and the structures that they were encountering. So it's both about direct representation, and it's also about the fact that I had a duty with them to create our voices of creating a change for society, to say, this is a social crisis and there's nothing that has to be real. This is a political choice that we make as a nation to not help these people, because we have the resources. We know that the resources out there. It's how we spend the resources. So I'm going to be a voice for getting those resources to invest in services that actually help people in a way that helps them get to a better place in their life. So for me, it's about direct representation as a lawyer and using my lawyer background along with the people that I'm with to be a voice for change.
Can you speak to any encounters that you had with law enforcement?
I have a twin brother. His name is Asia. My name is Asia. I was mistaken for him years ago. And basically, I was incarcerated for 3 days. Our social security numbers are exactly one number apart. So he's currently incarcerated, and he caught another case while he was incarcerated. So one day I was pulled over, and they thought I was him, and they arrested me. There was no bail or anything like that, and no one believed me. I'm like, I didn't do anything. I don't know why I'm here. But then when everybody's around you in jail saying the same thing, oh, we're innocent too. So it was really hard to deal with that, just because I was away from my twins for 3 days. I was away from my job for 3 days. I ended up losing my job, and then my studies in school were everywhere, because that's 3 days out of school. So it was really hard, especially considering the fact that I couldn't find a lawyer in Indiana. The lawyers told me no one would take on the case because they have to live in this city, when all I wanted was an expungement and an apology. I didn't get not one apology from the judge, the police officers, nothing like that. I did get a letter written saying that it was a mistake. So yeah, that's my experience with that.
Let's kind of shift to ID and talking about legal barriers. What barriers did any of you face obtaining photo identification, and how did you overcome these barriers?
One barrier I faced trying to obtain photo identification was not having an address. Another barrier I faced was I needed a social security card and a birth certificate. In order to obtain them, you have to have an ID.
You know, for some people who may not understand the importance of having a photo ID, maybe because they've always had one or never faced any barriers obtaining it, why do you feel that it is so important to have one, and just to kind of just generally educate people on some of the things and barriers that you faced when you don't have access to it?
Well, without an ID, you're nobody. Or you have no name, you have no age, you have nothing. You can't get a job, you can't go to school, you can't get no food, you can't get a house, can't get nothing with identification. ID is very important. ID tells who you are. When the police pull you over, you can go to jail without having an ID because they have no idea of who you are. So, yeah, so like it's very important to have a state ID, not just even a school ID. Like you need to have an ID from the state that you're living in.
Shifting and still talking about barriers, what barriers did any of you face while trying to complete high school or perhaps enter college?
So I didn't end up completing high school. I got my GED at the Orion Center in Seattle, but it took me 3 years to do that because I was houseless, because I had a dog, because I was struggling with a lot of like substance abuse and like trying to find ways to sort of like navigate, just like the trauma and the crisis that was my life. And it was really, really, really hard because I was able to go and I would get a test done and I'd be there for a month and I'd be super focused, and then something would come up and then I would have to stop going to school. But the way that I got through that and what was so helpful for me was the way that the Orion Center ran their GED program was basically just show up when you can show up, and we'll work with you on your terms, and we will make a point to meet you where you're at. And you know what? If where you're at is someplace that is not school day, well, that's fine. You can leave right now, too. You can go take care of that. When you're ready, you can come back. So it took me 3 years to get my GED, because in those 3 years, there was a lot of times where I ended up having to leave the state. But I still had the opportunity to go back, and I got to go to a place where people knew my name, where people knew my story.
Thank you. Anybody else want to speak to overcoming some of those educational obstacles?
Well, I was a part of the system, the DCFS system. So me going back to school without having a guardian to like come up to the school when I was suspended, or come up to the school when I needed medical assistance to take me to the doctor or whatever. So it was hard. So I just dropped out. So in the midst of me dropping out because of houselessness, medical bills, being pregnant, having kids, how did I overcome them? I ended up staying at the night ministry shelter, and I stayed there for 9 months until I obtained my apartment. And me staying at the night ministry, I had a stable environment. I was able to put my kids in daycare. I was able to go to school, finish getting my high school diploma, and I had a support. Like the main focus, to have somebody you can call family, someone to be there to support you. Like when you down, you could go talk to them, have trust in someone.
Some of the barriers that I experienced graduating from college was financial aid was a huge barrier. Having also been in foster care, having been experiencing homelessness, a lot of times there's a lot of paperwork that you have to complete when trying to get financial aid, and they ask you over and over again, if you're under the age of 24, you need a parent to complete your FAFSA. But because I didn't have a parent, I had to file as an independent student all the time, indicating that I was homeless. But in order to indicate that you were homeless, you had to go through a service agency to verify that you were homeless. But by this time I was in college, maybe 3 years, and I hadn't had any communication with any service agency. So having to keep going back to financial aid and explaining to them, I've been on my own since I was 16, like over and over again, like that process alone is very emotionally draining. It's tiring, and I could see why many students drop out just from that process alone. A way that I overcame that, I was able to get into a program on campus that supported former foster and former homeless youth on campus, that kind of helped you navigate, the campus life and campus bureaucracy. And I think that program, though I did not get connected to that program until my senior year, I think that program was very, very, very helpful for me just moving forward.
A lot of times when experiencing challenges, it sometimes could just take that one person to show that they care. I was pregnant in high school, and I had straight A's. I was on honor roll, the whole 9 yards, but there was a couple teachers that would pull me to the side and speak with me about how this school isn't for me and how I shouldn't be here and how I should go to a pregnant school because of the image of the school and everything. So I did drop out, but then the principal reached out and made me come in. And that just meant a lot because I wasn't homeless, but I was staying in a house. It didn't have a refrigerator, didn't have any utilities on. But even just him reaching out pushed me to move forward and graduate.
Yes. So I think that's a perfect segue into our final question. As much as it's important, right, to talk about these issues and unpack them because there's a lot of education in it. What solutions? Because, you know, I believe that there are people, right, who do want to help, organizations, entities who do want to help, but may not be informed to know what is it that, you know, you need when you're facing these various barriers regarding access to legal services, criminalization, or even access to education. So what solutions would you propose for those who want to contribute to be able to help?
I would say maybe more funding within the education system because there's a counselor, potentially a counselor in every school and everything, but I feel like it could be more. Social workers, counselors, and not only that, the children that show those clear-cut signs are normally the ones that go, that the counselors reach out to and things like that. But a lot of times those students that aren't showing anything could be going through the worst you can ever even imagine. So just maybe having segments or conversations with groups of students just to start to recognize those signs. And training can be expensive, but I feel like that's so important because children do spend the most of their days in schools.
I feel like we need access to legal services for young people across the board. And so I feel like whether that is, you know, like having lawyers and attorneys present, you know, in a drop-in center, in schools, or at least on call, like I feel like there should be some kind of conscious conversation and connection that is happening with the places where young people are and, you know, like other services, other legal services that could be potentially provided to them. On the topic of education, I feel like we need more low barrier education programs, you know, like the GED program I just talked about. We need people and places to meet young folks where they're at because otherwise, ultimately, you know, the system isn't going to work for anybody because even though if the school is here, if I don't have the capacity to show up to it, I'm not going to get my education. And that's really sort of, I mean, let's be real, let's be honest, like knowledge is power, you know, like someone said before. And that's really kind of what we need to be able to move forward in this world or not, just scratch that. Yeah, and just the criminalization piece, we just need to stop criminalizing not only homeless youth, but houseless everyone. It just still does not make sense to me why we are targeting people who are literally just trying to survive.
I think greater access to mental health is such an important piece because a lot of times youth that have experienced homelessness or even foster care, there's a lot of trauma that is involved in that. And then even just, you know, re-traumatizing with the barriers, you're reliving a lot of your trauma. And so I think, greater access to mental health services, and then also, especially on college campuses, to very practical things like leaving dorms open during, winter breaks, or maybe even having a supportive person on campus. They call those a SPOC, to have, some legislation that says like this is mandated. Every college must have a supportive person on campus to support, these student loan debt, to create a system where you don't have to become so in debt to go to college. And I think that's not just for homeless youth, right? For everyone. And so I think and even just funding that's available for youth that may be experiencing homelessness, because we have a lot of laws in the book for foster youth, and if you don't age out of the system, you may not still qualify, but some of those barriers and some of those challenges still look very much so the same. And so it's almost like you're taking a yardstick and saying, hey, here, your challenge is greater, so you get this pot of money, versus someone who may have that similar experience and not have access to those resources. So I think those things coupled together would be helpful.
So I love that Courtney touched on mental health awareness and services, because real quick experience, my twin brother, he's currently incarcerated. He's doing a lifetime commitment in a federal mental institution. So a lot of schools, they have programs like life skills and whatnot that they put the certain kids in, the bad kids in. But the individuals that were in his class are either in prison or dead, and then they all had mental illnesses. So just awareness and more programs. Like my family and I grew up in deep poverty. We didn't know what he had schizophrenia. We didn't know what schizophrenia was, autism was, none of that stuff. He used to say he heard voices. He used to talk about seeing pink elephants. But then as a family, we were just like, why are you playing crazy? Stop talking like that. Stop doing it. We knew nothing. There was no awareness.
One of the exciting things about the ABA's initiative, the Homeless Youth Legal Network, is the fact that for many years, unfortunately, the legal services have not been well integrated into the social service network, the housing, the drop-in centers, the shelter programs. It's really one of the last major portions that needs to be fully integrated to provide care for youth. And this is a really great time to help connect those systems in a way that's going to be meaningful for youth. And for that reason alone, I think also funders should hear that there's a need for assistance in this area. The thing that I often experience as an attorney, as a member of the American Bar Association, as well as what I hear from my youth clients, is that if they had had a lawyer sooner, they could have prevented a lot of the troubles that they had or a lot of the harm that they experienced because no one told them their rights. They didn't know they could appeal that decision. They didn't know they could stand up for themselves. They didn't know how to ask for services. And sometimes that takes, frankly, a lawyer in your corner in order to do that. To the extent that funders and communities can support this type of legal services work is very important because it's such a great return on their investment. And then I would also like to add, I also hear from many lawyers that say, I want to do something, but I have no background in this area. So I don't know how to talk to youth. I've never known anybody who has experienced homelessness. And I tell them that that should not be a barrier to them getting involved. I didn't have any background in this when I first started as a legal services attorney. And what I quickly found out was that there were many resources out there that I could get connected to. This particular initiative, the American Bar Association's Homeless Youth Legal Network, will actually help lawyers get trained in the issues and then also help them connect to experts in the field so they don't have to feel like they have to have all the answers themselves. They're the advocate who can help frame the issues and then connect to those resources that are most appropriate for the youth. And so I hope that anybody who has a caring heart that really wants to help address this social crisis will become involved.
For more information and to get involved, go to the American Bar Association Homeless Youth Legal Network website.